You may have noticed a trend in modern Hollywood. Writers making villains sympathetic and giving them backstories. Think Cruella de Vil, the monstrous old crone set on murdering masses of innocent Dalmatians, reimagined as a vampy hot fashionista. Or the evil and pompous Scar, who let his brother Mufasa tumble into oblivion and then usurped his throne, reimagined as a bright and optimistic cub frolicking about in the savannah. Or Ursula and the Little Mermaid, who, despite trying to kill Prince Eric and Ariel when her plans fail, was described by star Halle Bailey as misunderstood. "I can understand where she's coming from," Bailey said. "Sometimes experiences take you there. I honestly feel like she did what she had to do." The Wicked Witch of the West, threatening Dorothy and little Toto the dog too, has been reclaimed and reimagined as a self-conscious and even lovable figure in her early life, and worthy of some sisterly solidarity. And in the Rings of Power, even the orcs, the vicious, uncaring, flesh-eating goblins, have been reimagined as caring and protective fathers. This trend is driven partly by modern Hollywood's crazy over-reliance on prequels and reboots because they're so risk-averse about making new stories, and partly by a lightweight flakiness, applying modern ideas of seeing the real person beyond the social conditioning, marginalization, internalized trauma and grievance, and reclaiming such people and characters in a spirit of empathy and empowerment. This attitude sort of works in the context of real life, where people grow up in underprivileged communities or traumatic circumstances, but is cringeworthy when applied to traditional film or cartoon villains. Let villains be volatile, or theatrical, or debonair. Let them wreak havoc. Stories are about change and growth. For change to happen, there needs to be conflict and obstacles for the hero. The villain provides that. It is good for youngsters to learn that life is full of irredeemable, selfish, and conceited people. The sociopaths and psychopaths, the competitors who will be ruthless. Villains reflect the taboo, the forbidden, and often resonate with us on a personal level because they embody exaggerated versions of our flaws and weaknesses. In Freud, there is the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the here and now lust for sensations and stimulation, the greedy and vulgar impulses. The ego is the filter that helps the id get what it wants by acting in the social world of rules, and the superego is the moral and ethical principles about life and society. Villains represent the id, the lustful, selfish desires for satisfaction and pleasure and power. Villains are supposed to teach us something about how to act in society. It's one of the reasons why fables and fiction prefer a clearly defined good and bad. Villains represent a clash within us, the anarchic forces that tempt us, that we have to learn to regulate in order to emerge as fully fledged ideal people. It's why villains are always saying, "We're not so different, you and I." It's why Harry Potter and Voldemort are inextricably bound, so that one of them has to die, with Harry finally purging himself of his darker side. That's why Star Wars connects so strongly. Yoda describes the dark side of the Force as more seductive. That's why Luke sees his own face when Vader's mask bursts open in the cave on Dagobah. It's why Vader and the Emperor are always goading Luke to join them, to give in to his anger and passion and become more powerful. They're great themes. Or you could watch The Acolyte, which is about a coven of lesbian space witches, and a thirst-trapped dude on a beach, which is also cool. Now, in order to try and make sense of modern Hollywood's writers and their motivations when it comes to reimagining and even sympathizing with villains, I have to try my best to construct their point of view in their vernacular, approximating their encyclopedically intricate identity politics-driven postmodern sensibilities. I do a lot for you guys, so I hope you appreciate it. This is gonna be rough. Okay, here goes. Throughout history, in folklore and fairy tales, women have often suffered from a reductionism. On the one hand, portrayed as maidens, to be passively rescued, models of virtue, whose maidenhead and honor is to be claimed by a man. And on the other hand, if not blessing the community with offspring, they are marginalized and othered as figures to be wary of, caricatured as wicked or capricious, perhaps harboring resentments, jealousies, and erratic schemes, often associated with dark magic, spells, to lure the fertile young maidens of the community, to lead the young astray, to snatch from the cradle, to corrupt, to serve as cautionary tales, banished or willfully residing in the nether regions. The woods, the caves, the gingerbread house, the lonely hilltop castle, with their flattering mirrors and warts and their curled nails and their cats. In a modern society, and modern Hollywood, therefore, there should be a drive to reclaim those marginalized figures as misunderstood, as undervalued, as possessing an independence that should be recognized rather than spurned, that such archetypes are unfairly judged, that a patriarchal and heteronormative society that crafted such tales cast them in the most negative light, when in reality, they, and their modern counterparts, the independent ladies, can embrace those characters and imbue them with wit, sass, liveliness, agency, empoweringly reinvent them as tough sisters blazing their own trail, as sexy, and able to cast off all inhibitions and doubts. Ugh, that took it out of me. Let me have a second to gather myself, hose down the projectile vomit from the bathroom, wash my hands from having clutched to the toilet bowl while hurling a splatter of bile into it, and change my underwear from having failed to seal my bowels against a furious diuretic spray, leaving my briefs as soiled and soggy as a woman's bikini bottom after a mud wrestling contest, before resuming with an example. Ursula, from the feminist perspective, represents a character that exposes the realities behind society's expectations of women, and as well as a more truthful relationship between men and women. She serves as a socio-cultural critique, but her character is that of a greedy, insensitive, and conniving witch that tricks Ariel. We can sympathize with her because Triton betrayed her at a young age by giving her tentacles instead of a mermaid's tail. Her potential and opportunities were denied. Rather than dividing women into ideal and malign, virtuous and scurrilous, of maternal and spinster, of maid and harpy, of bounty and barrenness, modern Hollywood should deconstruct these binaries, devised, popularized, and sustained by men, in favor of a greater solidarity of womanhood, of sisters bonding across divides and life choices. Using familiar archetypes and characters throughout folklore and popular culture is a savvy and compelling way to bring such ideas to life. Okay, open up the oven door nice and wide, set the temperature to full, remove the metal racks so that there's plenty of headroom. Oh, alright, I'll keep going. Perhaps because I was born foolish. The overwhelming majority of women are great, have an equanimity, sensible groundedness, and sensitivity that pretty much makes the world go round. But, I hazard we could all agree, there are also Karens, out-and-out bitchy and insufferable ladies that make anyone who's ever worked in retail want to quit after the first week. There are also sanctimonious ladies who describe themselves as devout Christian, but get on their high horse and make snide, judgy remarks about other women's life choices. There are also Alyssa Mercanti types who profess to be enlightened and tolerant, but act like mean girls in a high school cafeteria in a leering, nasty way when there's a camera on them. In short, there are cold and ruthless and scheming ladies in real life, and there can therefore be villainous hags and harridans on screen too. Sigmund Freud, having given a lecture on phallic symbols, then asked by a cheeky student why he was always sucking on cigars, answered, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." In a similar vein, sometimes a villain is just a villain. I'll try to express the thinking of the modern Hollywood writers who are into this kind of revisionism, when it comes to villains' evil inclinations and evil deeds. Again, it's not good for my spirit or my heart to try and imitate their language. Okay. Any malice or bad acts the villains might have committed are due in part to society having cast them in the role of bad actors, of having stifled and condemned their instincts and desires, warping their spirits, so that, languishing in such societal oppression, their meanness is to a great extent a lashing out, the complex, even sad consequences of someone with immense natural energies unable to expend those energies in fulfilling ways because of a constricting and denying world. Hollywood, therefore, should take what opportunities it can to demystify and make such traditional villains more sympathetic, bringing them to the fore as more fully realized protagonists, even heroines. With the people we hate or judge, there might be more than meets the eye. Not everyone has the same privileges or opportunities. Some people with great potential are sometimes passed over and relegated to the fringes. It is not a fair society, and while we can't condone people's negative choices that impact on others, we can explore the formative influences and internalized feelings that well up and how they can ultimately have negative consequences for all. Hierarchies, no matter how well-meaning, are ultimately anachronistic and ought to be deconstructed. In Hollywood, a little of that spirit can be brought to the screen, with an emphasis on looking at the backstories of characters we've easily and conveniently othered, without understanding the kaleidoscope of morbidities and intersectional and performative elements of their life. Wicked witches, evil lions, etc., being fleshed out can imbue us, at least a little, with slight less inclination to reduce others to caricature. What harm could there be in that?
Sir, can you hear me, sir?
Duh.
Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and get off the pavement.
Leave me alone.
You've been lying there for an hour, disturbing the peace by shouting out obscenities while intoxicated, and alarming pedestrians with warnings and threats about the decline of society.
Duh. No, if you try to murder Ariel and Prince Eric because your plans fail, you're responsible for your actions, and you're a villain. If you want to skin 101 Dalmatian puppies for an item of clothing, then it doesn't matter if you have any internalized and unresolved issues or trauma. You're a villain. Anyway, there's just one more breakdown of modern Hollywood writers' preoccupation with reclaiming and de-villainizing villains, and it's to do with marginalization and caricature. Just let me blow away the cobwebs with a little Bolivian marching powder here. A cheeky bit of whiz-bang and devil's dandruff, just to take the edge off. You understand. Okay, I'm going back in with another approximation of how these people speak and think. Villains throughout the past have often been queer-coded and have therefore fed into negative stereotypes. Think James Bond's villains, who were almost always camp, affected, dapper, middle-aged bachelors. Ursula in The Little Mermaid is blatantly throaty-voiced, fat, and butch. By deconstructing these queer-coded characters, giving them backstory, and partially validating or acknowledging their motives, and looking beyond the lazy tropes, we can move on from these dated ideas and give audiences more to think about, and better characters to engage with. Well, firstly, Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot were all confirmed heterosexuals. Second, yeah, we could definitely dial back on the idea of the mincing and camp villain, but I think for the most part we already have. But Hollywood writers have kind of gotten a tangle over this. Because Doctor Who villain, Maestro, is played in a purring, bitchily high-strung and flamboyant way by a transgender actor, and Imperials are played in a high-camp kind of way in Disney Star Wars. So there's a bit of ambiguity, even hypocrisy, about these kinds of tropes. Villains being theatrical and scenery-chewing is always enjoyable, and no one's really complaining too much about coding. Villains, to put it succinctly, are good. They serve a purpose, narratively, and when their story becomes more elaborate or ambiguous, it detracts from the fun of the show or film. You can't fully feel the visceral suspense of them catching up to the hero, or visceral glee when they get their comeuppance. That's suited to more serious dramas. Doing that shit with old villains in family entertainment is lame and a bummer. Villains help young people acknowledge and contend with ideas about themselves on a latent level, which is far more exciting. An Ursula, or Wicked Witch with backstory and understandable motivations, will have kids scrolling through their phones while the film is on in the background. Daleks hated you, and a whole generation of kids leapt behind their couch and huddled there, simultaneously barely able to watch, and so riveted they were unable to take their eyes away.